Lady Alara Ashworth didn't know that the weary traveller standing at her family's kitchen door was the most powerful shifter in the Northern Territories. She didn't know that he had spent 3 years searching neighbouring kingdoms for his mate, testing noble daughters who had all failed his careful examination. And she certainly didn't know that her next words would seal a fate that would transform her from forgotten stepdaughter to chosen queen. What she did know was that the man swaying on his feet looked ready to collapse. "Please," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something deeper. "I'm looking for work, any work. I can tend horses, mend fences, chop wood." His clothes were travel-stained and torn at the shoulder, revealing a glimpse of sun-darkened skin. Dark hair fell across his forehead, partially concealing eyes the colour of storm clouds. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." Ilara's stepmother, Lady Margaret, appeared behind her with the swift precision of a hunting hawk. "Absolutely not. We don't employ vagrants." Her voice could have cut glass. "Move along before I set the dogs on you." "He's injured," Ilara said quietly, noticing the way he favoured his left side. Something in her chest pulled tight at the sight of the careful way he held himself as if movement caused pain. And he's asking for honest work, not charity. "Don't be ridiculous, Ilara. He's probably a thief or worse." Lady Margaret's lip curled in distaste. "Look at the state of him." The stranger's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for just a moment something dangerous flashed in those grey eyes, something that made Ilara's breath catch and her pulse quicken for reasons she couldn't name. Then it was gone, replaced by the resigned exhaustion of a man who had grown accustomed to rejection. "Of course," he said, inclining his head with a dignity that seemed at odds with his appearance. "I apologise for disturbing you." He turned to go, and Ilara noticed the barely concealed wince as he moved. "Wait!" The word left her lips before she could stop it. Both her stepmother and the stranger turned to look at her, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks under the intensity of his gaze. Up close, she could see that despite the grime and exhaustion, he was devastatingly handsome, in a way that made her heart stutter. "There's always work in the stables," she said, lifting her chin despite Lady Margaret's sharp intake of breath. "We lost 2 stable hands to the fever last month, and the horses need proper care." "Ilara," Lady Margaret hissed, "you have no authority to make such decisions." "Don't I?" Ilara's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "Father left me in charge of household management while you oversee the social calendar. The stables fall under household management." It was a stretch, and they all knew it, but her stepmother's eyes narrowed as she calculated the truth in the statement. The stranger watched this exchange with growing interest, his exhaustion seeming to fade as he studied Ilara's face. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition that made her skin warm under his gaze. "I'm Marcus," he said simply, and his voice held a gravity that seemed too large for a drifter seeking stable work. "Marcus Wolfhart. Lady Ilara." She curtsied slightly, then immediately felt foolish for the formality. He was seeking employment, not attending court. "Can you truly handle horses? They're spirited animals, and some can be dangerous." A smile ghosted across his lips, transforming his entire face. "I have experience with spirited creatures, my lady. I find they respond well to patience and respect." The way he said it made heat pool in her stomach, as if he were speaking about something else entirely. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that made her pulse race. She had the strangest urge to reach out and touch him, to smooth the worry lines from his forehead and tend to whatever wounds he carried. "Fine," Lady Margaret snapped, "but he sleeps in the stables, takes meals with the other servants, and if anything goes missing, he's gone immediately." She turned her icy gaze on Ilara. "And this arrangement is your responsibility. When your father returns and finds fault with your decision, you'll answer for it alone." "I understand," Ilara replied, though she wondered what madness had possessed her to defend a complete stranger. Something about him called to her, pulled at something deep in her chest like a golden thread drawing her forward. Lady Margaret swept from the kitchen with a rustle of expensive silk, leaving Ilara alone with Marcus. In the sudden quiet, she became acutely aware of his presence, of the way he seemed to fill the space despite his exhaustion. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Standing up to her like that, I can see it cost you." "Everyone deserves a chance to prove their worth," Ilara replied, then flushed at how naive that sounded. "You mean exactly what you said." His voice was soft but certain. "It's a rare quality, my lady. Kindness without expectation of return." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. Despite his dishevelled state, he stood with a natural authority that seemed incongruous with his circumstances. His hands, though dirty, bore calluses in patterns that spoke of sword work rather than common labour. And there was something in his eyes, a depth of understanding that suggested he had seen far more of the world than most wandering workers. "Are you truly just a drifter seeking work?" she asked before she could stop herself. For a moment his expression became unreadable. Then he smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. "I'm exactly what you need me to be, Lady Ilara." The cryptic response should have worried her. Instead, it sent a thrill through her that she didn't understand. There was something about this man that defied explanation, something that made her want to unravel his mysteries one careful thread at a time. "Come," she said, moving toward the kitchen pantry. "You said you haven't eaten. We'll remedy that first, then I'll show you to the stables." She began gathering bread, cheese and cold meat, acutely aware of his gaze following her movements. "What brings you to our lands? Are you from the Northern Territories?" "Among other places," he said carefully. "I've been travelling for some time, looking for the right place to settle." He paused, and when she glanced at him, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "I think I may have found it." The simple words carried weight that seemed to press against her ribs, making breathing difficult. She busied herself with preparing a meal, trying to ignore the way her hands shook slightly under his regard. "Your stepmother seems less than fond of you," Marcus observed, accepting the plate she offered with a grace that spoke of good breeding. "Is there no one else in your family who might support your decisions?" Ilara's laugh held no humour. "My father is away on business in the capital. My stepbrothers care only for hunting and drinking, and my stepmother—" She shrugged, unwilling to voice the full truth of her situation. "She tolerates my presence because she must." "And your own family?" "Dead." The word came out sharper than she intended. "My mother died when I was 12. My father remarried within the year." She watched him eat, noting how he managed to appear refined despite his obvious hunger. "What of you? Do you have family?" Something painful flickered across his features. "I did. They're gone now." He met her eyes, and she saw an echo of her own loneliness reflected there. "I suppose that makes us both orphans of a sort." The shared understanding hung between them, a bridge built of mutual loss. Ilara found herself stepping closer, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name. "I'm sorry for your loss." "And I for yours." His voice was gentle, but there was steel underneath it. "Though I suspect your current situation is far from the comfort you deserve." Heat rushed to her cheeks. "I shouldn't have spoken so freely. You must think me terribly improper." "I think," Marcus said, rising from his seat with fluid grace, "that you're the first honest person I've encountered in a very long time." He stepped closer, and she caught a scent that seemed impossible. Pine forests and winter air, wild and clean beneath the dust of travel. "It's refreshing." They stood there in the kitchen's golden afternoon light, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. Her heart hammered against her ribs as if trying to reach toward him, and for a moment she forgot entirely that he was a stranger seeking employment. He was just Marcus, and he was looking at her as if she were something precious. "I should show you to the stables," she said breathlessly, though she made no move to step away. "Yes," he agreed, but he didn't move either. "You should." The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility, until the sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell. Ilara jerked backward, just as her stepbrother Roderick appeared in the doorway. "Oh, what's this?" Roderick's gaze moved between them with sharp interest. "Mother said you'd hired another servant." "A stable hand," Ilara said quickly, trying to calm her racing pulse. "This is Marcus. Marcus, my stepbrother, Lord Roderick." Marcus inclined his head with careful respect, but Ilara noticed how his posture shifted, becoming more guarded. "My lord." Roderick's eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus, taking in the breadth of his shoulders, the easy way he held himself despite his travel-worn appearance. "You look capable enough, but understand this. We've had problems with thieves in these parts. Cross us, and you'll regret it." "I understand completely," Marcus replied, his voice neutral. But something in his tone made Ilara glance at him sharply. There had been an undercurrent there, something that suggested Roderick's threat was far less intimidating than he imagined. "Good, Ilara, Mother wants to see you about the arrangements for tomorrow's dinner party." Roderick's smile held malicious satisfaction. "Lord Blackwood will be attending, and she wants everything perfect for your meeting." Ilara's blood went cold. Meeting. "Surely you didn't think you'd remain a spinster forever. Lord Blackwood has expressed interest in a marriage alliance." Roderick's grin widened at her obvious distress. "Congratulations, sister. You're to be a bride." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she heard Marcus's sharp intake of breath beside her. When she dared to glance at him, she saw that his hands had clenched into fists, and his eyes had gone hard as winter stone. "I see," she managed, her voice barely steady. "How fortunate." "Indeed." Roderick looked between them once more, suspicion flickering across his features. "Marcus, isn't it? Remember your place here. Lady Ilara is far above your station." He turned to go, then paused. "And Marcus, I'll be keeping an eye on you." When they were alone again, the kitchen felt different. The golden warmth had been replaced by something tense and charged. Ilara stared at her hands, fighting the urge to cry. "Lord Blackwood," Marcus said quietly. "Tell me about him." "Why?" she asked, surprised by the question. "Because," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up, something that promised violence barely leashed. "Any man who would take an unwilling bride deserves careful consideration." The protective note in his tone sent warmth spiralling through her chest, even as it confused her. Why would a stable hand care about her marital prospects? Why did he speak as if he had the power to do something about it? But before she could voice these questions, Marcus stepped back, his expression closing off. "Forgive me, it's not my place to comment on such matters." "No," Ilara said softly, meeting his eyes. "But thank you for caring. It's been a long time since anyone has." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than master and servant, deeper than the careful boundaries society demanded. Whatever Marcus Wolfhart truly was, whatever secrets lay behind those storm-grey eyes, Ilara knew with sudden certainty that her life had just taken a turn towards something extraordinary. She only hoped they would both survive it. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and growing confusion. Ilara found herself drawn to the stables at every opportunity, carrying water for the horses or mending tack that didn't truly need repair. Each excuse felt thinner than the last, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. Something about Marcus pulled at her like a golden thread, drawing her toward him despite every rational thought that screamed about propriety and social boundaries. He had proven himself capable beyond her wildest expectations. The horses, notorious for their temperamental nature, responded to him with an almost supernatural calm. Even Thunder, her father's prize stallion who had injured 2 previous stable hands, allowed Marcus to approach without so much as a snort of displeasure. "How do you do it?" she asked one afternoon, watching him brush down Thunder's midnight coat with gentle, confident strokes. "He's never allowed anyone but my father to handle him." Marcus glanced up from his work, and those storm-grey eyes held a hint of amusement. Sometimes the most powerful creatures simply need to know you're not afraid of them. His voice carried a gravity that seemed too large for a simple observation about horses. They can sense fear, but they also recognize strength when they encounter it. The way he said it made her wonder if they were still talking about horses at all. She had taken to bringing him meals in the evenings, claiming it was more efficient than having him come to the servants' hall. In truth, she treasured those quiet moments when they sat together in the stable's golden lamplight, talking about everything and nothing. He listened to her thoughts about books and music and dreams with an attention that made her feel precious, as if her words carried weight in a world that had always dismissed them. "You speak of the Northern Territories as if you've lived there," she observed one evening, noting how his descriptions of the mountain kingdoms held the intimacy of personal experience rather than travellers' tales. Marcus paused in his careful mending of a bridle, his hands stilling on the leather. "I've spent considerable time there, yes." "Doing what?" "Various work." His answer was deliberately vague, but she caught the way his shoulders tensed. The Northern Territories have complex politics, many opportunities for a man with the right skills. What sort of skills? He looked at her then, and something flickered in his expression, a calculation, as if he were weighing how much truth to reveal. Leadership, strategy, the ability to make difficult decisions. He resumed his work, but his voice held a new edge. "The kind of skills that come with responsibility I sometimes wish I could set aside." Ilara studied his profile in the lamplight, noting the aristocratic line of his nose, the way he held himself with unconscious authority, even when performing menial tasks. His hands, she had observed, bore calluses in patterns that spoke of sword work, not common labour. And there was something in the way he moved, a controlled power that reminded her of predatory grace. "You weren't always a wandering worker, were you?" she said quietly. Marcus's hands stilled completely. When he looked at her, his eyes held a vulnerability that took her breath away. "What makes you say that?" "Everything." She gestured toward him, taking in his bearing, his speech patterns, the careful way he observed everything around him. "You move like nobility. You speak like you've received the finest education, and the horses respond to you as if you're—" She searched for the right words. "As if you're someone they should respect. Perhaps I'm simply good with animals." "No." Her voice was certain. "There's something else, something you're not telling me." The silence stretched between them, taut with unspoken truths. Marcus set aside the bridle and turned to face her fully, and in the lamplight she could see the internal struggle playing across his features. "If I told you that everything about my current circumstances was temporary," he said carefully, "that I'm not what I appear to be, would that frighten you?" Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she held his gaze steadily. "It would intrigue me." Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to something that looked like hope. "You're not what I expected, Lady Ilara." "What did you expect?" "Someone different. Someone who would care more about station and appearance than character." He reached out as if to touch her face, then seemed to catch himself, his hand falling back to his side. Someone who wouldn't defend a stranger or tend to his wounds or risk her stepmother's anger for the sake of kindness. The intensity in his voice made heat spiral through her chest. "How could you know what to expect? We'd never met before 3 days ago." Marcus went very still, and she saw something that looked like panic flicker across his features before he mastered it. "I meant, in general, most noble ladies care little for those beneath their station." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about his tone suggested deeper meaning. Before she could press further, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. His stepbrother Roderick appeared in the stable doorway, his eyes immediately narrowing as he took in the intimate scene. "How domestic," he said with cold amusement. "Playing servant girl again, Ilara." Heat flooded her cheeks, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I was ensuring the horses are properly cared for. Father will expect a full report when he returns." "I'm sure he will." Roderick's gaze shifted to Marcus, who had risen and stepped slightly in front of Ilara. A protective gesture so subtle she almost missed it. "And you, stable hand, working late, I see." "The horses require regular care, my lord," Marcus replied, his voice carefully neutral. But Ilara caught the way his posture had shifted, becoming more alert, more dangerous. "Indeed." Roderick smiled, but it held no warmth. "Tell me, Marcus, what exactly is your experience with horses?" "I've worked with them most of my life." "Have you?" Roderick circled them slowly, like a predator stalking prey. "And where was this experience gained?" Ilara saw Marcus's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Various estates throughout the territories." "How convenient. And I suppose you have references from these previous employers?" "My lord," Ilara interjected, sensing the trap being laid. "Surely Marcus's skill speaks for itself. The horses have never been better cared for." "Oh, I don't question his skill with horses," Roderick said, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "I question everything else about him." He stopped directly in front of Marcus, close enough that the height difference became apparent. Marcus was taller by several inches, broader through the shoulders, and despite Roderick's attempts at intimidation, he radiated a quiet confidence that made her stepbrother's posturing seem foolish. "Is there something specific you wish to know?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Everything." Roderick's smile turned predatory. "Starting with why a man of your obvious capabilities would be content with stable work." The question hung in the air like a blade. Ilara held her breath, watching the interplay between the two men. There was something happening here beyond a simple interrogation, some undercurrent of challenge and recognition that she didn't fully understand. "Sometimes," Marcus said slowly, "a man chooses simpler work because it allows him to focus on what truly matters." "And what matters to you?" Marcus's gaze shifted to Ilara for just a moment, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Finding something worth protecting." The words hit her like a physical force, sending warmth spiraling through her entire body. There was no mistaking his meaning, no way to pretend he was speaking generally. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that something profound was happening between them, something that defied logic and social convention. Roderick's eyes narrowed dangerously. How presumptuous for a servant. "Perhaps," Marcus agreed, but there was steel in his voice now. "But presumption requires one to reach above their true station. How can you be certain of what that is?" The challenge was subtle, but unmistakable. Ilara saw Roderick's face flush with anger, saw his hand move instinctively toward the sword at his hip. But something in Marcus's stillness, in the way he held himself ready for violence, made her stepbrother think better of it. "Mother wants to see you, Ilara," Roderick said instead, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "About your dress for tomorrow evening's dinner. Lord Blackwood will be expecting you to look appropriate." The mention of Lord Blackwood hit her like cold water. She had managed to push the looming engagement to the back of her mind, but Roderick's words brought reality crashing back. Tomorrow night she would be presented to a man she had never met, expected to charm him into offering marriage, with no consideration for her own wishes in the matter. "Of course," she managed, her voice barely steady. Marcus went very still beside her. "Tomorrow evening?" "The betrothal dinner," Roderick said with malicious satisfaction, watching Marcus's reaction carefully. "Lord Blackwood is quite eager to meet his intended bride. I hear he's particularly interested in obedient wives." Something dangerous flashed in Marcus's eyes, something that made the air in the stable feel suddenly charged with threat. "Obedient? Of course. What use is a wife who doesn't know her place?" Roderick's smile widened, "though I suppose that concept is foreign to someone of your background." "Actually," Marcus said, his voice going deadly quiet. "I'm quite familiar with the concept of knowing one's place." He took a step forward, and suddenly he seemed larger, more imposing, radiating an authority that made Roderick instinctively step back. "The question is whether you truly understand yours." The words carried an undercurrent of threat that made Ilara's pulse race. For a moment, Marcus didn't look like a stable hand at all. He looked like someone accustomed to command, someone whose authority was absolute and unquestioned. Roderick's face went pale, then flushed with confused anger. "What did you say?" But Marcus had already stepped back, his expression returning to careful neutrality. "I said I understand the importance of respect, my lord. Nothing more." The moment stretched taut between them, filled with unspoken challenges and barely leashed violence. Then Roderick turned on his heel and stalked away, leaving Ilara alone with Marcus and the lingering tension of near conflict. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly, though part of her thrilled at the way he had defended her honour. "Done what?" "Challenged him. He has the power to dismiss you, to make your life difficult." Marcus turned to look at her, and in the lamplight his eyes held a hint of something that looked almost like amusement. "Does he?" The simple question carried layers of meaning that she didn't understand. But before she could ask what he meant, he reached out and gently touched her hand, sending electricity shooting up her arm. "Lady Ilara," he said, his voice soft but intense, "I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow evening, whatever pressure they put on you, you have choices. You always have choices." "Do I?" The question came out more bitter than she intended. "I'm a woman with no fortune of my own, no powerful connections, no family willing to support my wishes. What choices do I truly have?" "More than you know," he said, and there was something in his tone that sounded almost like a promise. "Trust me." She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to demand answers to the growing list of questions his behaviour raised. But the intensity in his eyes, the way he was looking at her, as if she were something infinitely precious, drove all rational thought from her mind. Instead, she found herself stepping closer, drawn by an invisible force that seemed to emanate from him like heat. "Who are you really, Marcus Wolfhart?" His free hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with devastating gentleness. "I'm someone who never believed in fate," he said quietly, "until 3 days ago." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Ilara's heart hammered so hard she was certain he could hear it, but she couldn't bring herself to step away. Something was happening here, something that felt larger than both of them, as inevitable as sunrise. "Marcus," she whispered, not even certain what she meant to say. He leaned closer, and she caught that impossible scent again, pine forests and winter air, wild and clean and utterly intoxicating. His eyes searched her face as if memorizing every detail, and she saw her own desperate longing reflected in their grey depths. "Tomorrow changes everything," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But tonight you're still free to choose." She knew he was going to kiss her, knew she should stop him, should remember propriety and station and all the reasons this was impossible. Instead, she rose on her tiptoes, closing the distance between them, choosing him with every fibre of her being. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he were giving her every opportunity to pull away. But when she melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt, he deepened it with a hunger that stole her breath. She had never been kissed before, but some instinct older than thought guided her response, and when he finally lifted his head, she was dizzy with want and wonder. "Ilara," he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. But even as she savoured the moment, even as she memorised the feel of his arms around her, reality pressed at the edges of her consciousness. Tomorrow would bring Lord Blackwood an expectation she couldn't escape. Tomorrow would force her to choose between duty and desire. Tonight she had chosen Marcus. Tomorrow she might lose him forever. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as she looked into his storm-grey eyes and saw the fierce determination there, she felt something that might have been hope. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever secrets he carried, she was no longer facing it alone. And somehow that changed everything. The storm came without warning, as if the very heavens were responding to the turmoil in Ilara's heart. She had spent the day enduring fittings for her dinner gown, sitting through her stepmother's lectures about proper behaviour with Lord Blackwood, and fighting the desperate urge to run to the stables where Marcus was working. The kiss from the night before lingered on her lips like a brand, a constant reminder of how completely her world had shifted in the space of a heartbeat. By evening, when the first rumbles of thunder rolled across the darkening sky, she could bear it no longer. The servants were all occupied with preparations for the following night's elaborate dinner, and Lady Margaret had retired early with one of her frequent headaches. Ilara slipped from the house through the kitchen door, pulling her cloak tight against the wind that whipped through the courtyard with increasing violence. The stable was warm and golden with lamplight, a sanctuary from the storm gathering overhead. She found Marcus in Thunder's stall, speaking to the agitated stallion in low, soothing tones that seemed to calm the animal despite the lightning flashing outside. "He doesn't like storms," Marcus said without turning, somehow sensing her presence. "Reminds him of the night his previous owner died in a hunting accident." "How do you know that?" Ilara asked, moving closer. In the lamplight, Marcus looked different somehow, more substantial, as if the shadows and flickering flames revealed his true nature rather than concealing it. "Animals remember trauma differently than humans do. They carry it in their bodies, in their instincts." He turned to face her, and she caught her breath at the intensity in his storm-grey eyes. "The scent of fear, the sound of violence, it stays with them." Something in his tone suggested he spoke from personal experience. "Is that why you understand them so well, because you carry your own trauma?" Marcus went very still, his hand pausing in its gentle stroking of Thunder's neck. "What makes you think I carry trauma?" "The way you move, like you're always ready for attack. The way you watch everything, cataloguing threats before they emerge." She stepped closer, drawn by the vulnerability she glimpsed beneath his careful control. "The way you sometimes look at me as if you can't quite believe I'm real." The words hung between them in the storm-charged air. Outside, rain began to patter against the stable roof, soft at first, then building to a steady drumming that created a cocoon of intimacy around them. "You see too much," Marcus said quietly, but there was no accusation in his voice, only wonder. "Or perhaps you reveal more than you realise." She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his hand where it rested on the stall door. The contact sent electricity racing up her arm, that same impossible warmth that seemed to emanate from him like magic. "Tell me about your trauma, Marcus. Tell me what haunts you." For a long moment she thought he would refuse. He stood frozen in the golden light, his expression cycling through emotions she couldn't name. Then Thunder nickered softly, as if encouraging his caretaker to speak, and something in Marcus's defences crumbled. "My parents," he said, his voice rough with old pain. "They were killed when I was 17, murdered by those who coveted what my family possessed." Ilara's heart clenched with sympathy. "I'm so sorry. That must have been devastating." "Devastating." He repeated the word as if testing its adequacy. "Yes, I suppose it was. But it was also transformative. I learned that night that the world is far more dangerous than I had believed, that power makes you a target, and that those you trust most can be the ones who betray you." The bitterness in his voice made her step closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. Beneath her palm his heart beat strong and fast, and she could feel the tension coiled in his muscles like a spring wound too tight. "Who betrayed you?" "Someone I considered a friend, someone my father trusted with our lives." His eyes went distant, lost in memories that clearly still had the power to wound. "He led the assassins straight to us, all for the promise of gold and position in the new regime. What happened to him? Something shifted in Marcus's expression, something cold and final that made her shiver despite the warmth of the stable. Justice was served, eventually. The way he said it suggested that he had been the one to serve it, and Ilara found herself wondering exactly what sort of man she had fallen for. But rather than frightening her, the hint of darkness in his past only made her want to comfort him more. And after, what did you do after your parents died? I survived. I learned to fight, to plan, to never again trust blindly. His gaze focused on her face, and she saw vulnerability there that took her breath away. I told myself I would never allow anyone close enough to hurt me again. And yet here you are, she whispered, her thumb tracing gentle circles over his chest, telling me your secrets. Here I am, he agreed, his voice dropping to a rough whisper, breaking every rule I made to protect myself. The admission hung between them like a bridge, an invitation to cross into deeper intimacy. Outside, the storm was building to true fury now, lightning illuminating the stable windows in brilliant flashes that made the shadows dance. Why? She asked, though part of her feared the answer. Why break those rules for me? Marcus's hands came up to frame her face, his touch so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. Because from the moment I saw you defend me to your stepmother, I knew you were different, because you see kindness as strength rather than weakness, because you look at me as if I matter, not for what I can provide or what position I hold, but for who I am. The words hit her like a physical force, sending warmth spiraling through her entire being. You do matter, more than you know. Ilara. Her name on his lips was a prayer, a plea, a promise all at once. There are things about me, about my life, that you don't understand, things that could change everything between us. Then tell me. She rose on her tiptoes, bringing their faces closer together. Trust me with your secrets, Marcus. I'm stronger than you think. For a moment, she thought he would confess everything, whatever truth lay behind his too knowing eyes and unconscious authority. But then thunder snorted nervously as thunder crashed overhead, and the moment shattered like glass. I want to, Marcus said, his voice heavy with regret. God help me, I want to tell you everything, but not yet, not until... Not until what? Not until I'm certain it won't destroy what we're building. His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, wiping away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. Some truths are too dangerous to share lightly. Before she could protest, before she could demand the honesty she craved, his lips were on hers with a desperation that stole her breath. This kiss was different from the gentle exploration of the night before, hungrier, more urgent, as if he were trying to pour all his unspoken truths into the contact between them. She melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt as he backed her against the stable wall. The rough wood pressed against her spine, but she barely noticed, lost in the taste of him, in the way his body surrounded her with warmth and strength and the promise of safety. Ilara, he breathed against her lips, and she could hear the torment in his voice. You have no idea what you do to me. Show me, she whispered back, surprising herself with her boldness. His response was a low growl that sent heat pooling in her stomach. His lips found the sensitive spot beneath her ear, and she gasped at the sensation, her head falling back against the wall. This was madness, kissing a stable hand in the middle of a storm, letting him touch her as if she belonged to him rather than to the noble marriage that awaited her tomorrow. But it felt right in a way that defied logic, as if every moment of her life had been leading to this one perfect connection. Marcus! She gasped as his lips traced a path down her throat. Tomorrow? Tomorrow doesn't exist, he said fiercely, lifting his head to look at her with eyes that blazed like molten silver. There is only this moment, only us, only the truth of what we feel for each other. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lose herself completely in the fantasy that they could exist outside the constraints of society and obligation. But reality pressed at the edges of her consciousness like the storm pressing at the stable walls. "Lord Blackwood will expect an answer tomorrow night," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "My stepmother has made it clear that refusal isn't an option." Something dangerous flashed across Marcus's features, a cold fury that transformed his handsome face into something altogether more predatory. "Tell me about him, this Lord Blackwood. What do you know of his character?" The question struck her as odd. What would a stable hand care about the character of a noble lord? But the intensity in his voice demanded an answer. "I know very little," she admitted. "Only that he's wealthy, recently widowed, and seeking a new wife. Roderick says he's eager for the alliance with our family, though I can't imagine why. We have little to offer in terms of fortune or influence." "Perhaps he seeks something other than fortune," Marcus said, his voice gone deadly quiet. "Such as?" "Compliance. Some men value obedience above all else in a wife." His hands tightened slightly on her waist, and she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. "Has no one told you anything of his treatment of his first wife?" A chill ran down her spine at his tone. "She died in childbirth, that's all I know." "Convenient," Marcus muttered, and there was something in his expression that suggested he knew more than he was saying. "What do you mean?" But before he could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps made them spring apart. Ilara barely had time to smooth her hair and compose herself before her stepbrother Roderick appeared in the stable doorway, his cloak dripping with rain and his face dark with suspicion. "Well, well," he said, his gaze moving between them with sharp interest. "Out for an evening stroll in the storm, sister?" "The horses were agitated by the thunder," Ilara said quickly, grateful that her voice sounded steady. "I wanted to ensure they were properly cared for." "How thoughtful!" Roderick's smile held no warmth as he stepped into the stable, water pooling around his boots. "And you, Marcus? Working late again, I see." "The animals need tending regardless of the weather, my lord," Marcus replied, his voice carefully neutral. But Ilara could see the way he positioned himself slightly between her and Roderick, a protective gesture so subtle she almost missed it. "Of course they do." Roderick moved closer, and Ilara caught the scent of wine on his breath. He had been drinking, which always made him more cruel, more unpredictable. "Tell me, stable hand, what do you think of my sister's upcoming engagement?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Ilara saw Marcus's hands clench into fists at his sides, saw the muscle in his jaw tick with barely controlled emotion. "It's not my place to have opinions about such matters, my lord," Marcus said carefully. "No, it isn't," Roderick agreed, "but I suspect you have them anyway." He circled them slowly like a predator toying with prey. "I've noticed how attentive you've been to Lady Ilara's needs, how protective. I serve the household to the best of my ability." "Do you?" Roderick stopped directly in front of Marcus, and despite the height difference there was something menacing in his posture. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're serving yourself to something that doesn't belong to you." The insult was clear, and Ilara saw something flash in Marcus's eyes, something that made the air in the stable feel suddenly charged with violence. For a moment she feared he would lose control entirely, would reveal whatever carefully hidden nature he possessed in defence of her honour. "Roderick," she said quickly, stepping between them, "that's enough. Marcus has done nothing improper." "Hasn't he?" Roderick's gaze shifted to her, and she saw the calculated cruelty there. "You forget, dear sister, that I have eyes. I've seen the way you look at him, the way you find excuses to visit the stables. It's unseemly." Heat flooded her cheeks, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Roderick's smile turned vicious. "You've developed an inappropriate attachment to a servant, and it ends now. Marcus, you're dismissed. Collect your wages and be gone by morning." No! The word tore from Ilara's throat before she could stop it. You have no right. I have every right, Roderick cut her off. Father left me in charge of estate security, and I've determined that this man poses a threat to our family's reputation. Something cold and final settled in Ilara's stomach. This was it, the moment she had been dreading, when the fragile bubble of happiness she had built around Marcus finally burst. But Marcus stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made both siblings freeze. Actually, he said quietly, I don't think you do. The words were soft, almost conversational, but they carried an undercurrent of power that seemed to fill the stable like a physical presence. Roderick's face went pale, then flushed with confused anger. What did you say? Marcus smiled, and it was nothing like the gentle expressions Ilara had grown to love. This smile was sharp, predatory, the expression of a man who had just decided to stop pretending to be harmless. I said, he repeated, taking a step closer to Roderick, that I don't think you have the authority you believe you possess. The temperature in the stable seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thunder crashed overhead, and in the lightning that followed, Ilara could have sworn she saw Marcus's eyes flash with an inhuman light. You're just a stable hand, Roderick said, but his voice had lost its confidence. Am I? Marcus tilted his head, studying Roderick like a scientist examining an interesting specimen. Tell me, Lord Roderick, what do you know about the Northern Territories? The non sequitur seemed to confuse Roderick even further. What does that matter? Humour me. They're wild lands, ruled by shifter clans and their alpha kings. Roderick's voice held the dismissive tone of someone discussing fairy tales. And what would you do, Marcus continued conversationally, if you discovered that one of those alpha kings was standing in your stable? The question hung in the air like smoke. Ilara felt her heart stop, then begin racing so fast she could barely breathe. Because suddenly, impossibly, everything made sense. The way horses responded to him, his unconscious authority, the education and refinement he tried to hide, the way he spoke of justice and power as if from personal experience. That's ridiculous, Roderick said, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. You're a servant, a nobody. Marcus's smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too sharp in the lamplight. Am I? And as thunder crashed again overhead, as lightning illuminated the stable in brilliant white light, Ilara finally understood the truth about the man she had fallen in love with. She had shown kindness to a servant, but the servant had been a king all along. The engagement celebration was a mockery of everything Ilara had ever dreamed her future might hold. She stood in her elaborately appointed chamber, staring at her reflection in the full-length mirror, while her lady's maid fastened the hundreds of tiny pearl buttons that ran up the back of her emerald silk gown. The dress was beautiful. Her stepmother had spared no expense in ensuring she looked every inch the perfect bride, but to Ilara it felt like a burial shroud. Lord Blackwood had arrived that afternoon with a retinue of guards and servants that spoke to wealth and power. She had watched from her window as he dismounted from his coal-black destrier, taking in his imposing height and the cruel set of his mouth. Even from a distance, everything about him screamed danger of the worst kind, not the wild, thrilling danger she sensed in Marcus, but something cold and calculating that made her skin crawl. "Hold still, my lady," the maid murmured, struggling with a particularly stubborn button. "You look beautiful. Lord Blackwood will be quite pleased." Pleased, as if she were a prize mare being presented for breeding. The thought made bile rise in her throat. A soft knock at her door interrupted her dark thoughts. "Come," she called, expecting her stepmother with another lecture about proper behaviour. Instead, Marcus stepped into the room. He had clearly made an effort to clean himself up. His hair was neatly combed. His clothes, while still simple servant's garb, were clean and pressed. But there was something different about him tonight, something that made the maid gasp and step back instinctively. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, and when his storm-grey eyes met hers in the mirror, She saw an intensity there that took her breath away. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, acutely aware of the maid's presence. "Leave us," Marcus said quietly, never taking his eyes off Ilara's reflection. The maid looked between them uncertainly. "But my lady—" "Leave us," Marcus repeated, and this time his voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. The girl fled without another word, pulling the door shut behind her. In the sudden silence, Ilara turned to face him, and what she saw in his expression made her heart clench with desperate longing. He looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, as if the sight of her in her finery was both a blessing and a curse. "You look—" he swallowed hard, seeming to struggle for words. "You look like a queen." The compliment hit her like a physical blow. "I look like a prisoner dressed for execution?" "Ilara." He crossed the room in 3 swift strides, stopping just close enough that she could catch his scent. Pine forests and winter air, wild and clean, and utterly at odds with the civilized luxury surrounding them. "We need to talk." "About what? About how you're not who you pretended to be? About how everything between us has been built on lies?" The words came out sharper than she intended, but the pain of discovery was still too raw, too overwhelming. "About how I'm going to get you out of this," he said simply. She stared at him, searching his face for any hint of deception. "You're a stable hand, Marcus. What could you possibly do against a lord with his wealth and connections?" Something shifted in his expression, a decision being made. "I'm not a stable hand." "Then what are you?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but utterly certain. "I'm someone who has the power to protect you, someone who would burn the world to keep you safe." His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing across her skin with devastating gentleness. "Someone who loves you more than his own life." The words hit her like lightning, sending warmth spiraling through her entire being. But before she could respond, before she could demand the full truth she desperately craved, voices in the corridor outside warned of approaching footsteps. Marcus stepped back, just as Lady Margaret burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement and wine. "Ilara, Lord Blackwood is asking for you specifically. He wants to—" "What are you doing here?" Her voice turned sharp as ice as she noticed Marcus. "The lady's mirror needed adjusting, my lady," Marcus said smoothly, inclining his head with perfect servility. "The light wasn't flattering." Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but she was too focused on the evening's importance to pursue the matter. "Well, get out, now. Lord Blackwood is waiting, and first impressions are crucial." Marcus bowed again and moved toward the door, but as he passed Ilara, his fingers brushed against hers in a touch so brief it might have been accidental. But the electricity that shot up her arm at the contact was anything but accidental, and the promise she saw in his eyes made her heart race with hope she didn't dare acknowledge. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion, draped in the finest silks and lit with hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The long oak table groaned under the weight of elaborate dishes, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and expensive wines. Lord Blackwood rose as she entered, and Ilara had to suppress a shudder at her first close look at the man who intended to become her husband. He was handsome in a cold, sharp way, with pale blue eyes that seemed to catalogue her worth as if she were livestock at market. When he smiled, it didn't reach those calculating eyes. "Lady Ilara," he said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as deadly, "you are even more beautiful than I was told." She curtsied with practised grace, though her skin crawled at the way his gaze lingered on the neckline of her gown. "Lord Blackwood, welcome to our home." "Our home," he repeated, and there was possession in his tone that made her stomach turn. "Yes, I like the sound of that." He offered his arm. "Shall we dine?" The meal that followed was an exercise in carefully controlled torture. Lord Blackwood regaled the table with stories of his wealth and influence, making it clear that he expected Ilara to be suitably impressed. He spoke of his estates, his business ventures, his connections at court, all while his pale eyes assessed her reactions with cold calculation. "I understand you enjoy reading, Lady Ilara," he said during the third course, cutting into his meat with precise, almost surgical movements. "A charming hobby for a woman, though naturally you'll have little time for such frivolities once we're wed." "Frivolities?" she repeated, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "Books fill a woman's head with unrealistic expectations," he explained condescendingly. "Romance novels in particular. I'm sure you understand the importance of realistic expectations in marriage." Across the table, Roderick smirked. "Ilara has always been rather fanciful in her thinking. I'm sure you'll cure her of that quickly enough." Lord Blackwood's smile turned predatory. "Oh, I have considerable experience in correcting inappropriate behaviour. My late wife was similarly spirited when we first married. She learned to be more accommodating." Something in his tone made ice form in Ilara's veins. The way he spoke of his dead wife, the casual cruelty in his voice, painted a picture of marriage that terrified her more than any physical threat ever could. Movement at the edge of her vision caught her attention. Marcus was serving wine at the far end of the table, but his posture was rigid with barely controlled fury. Even from a distance she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the wine pitcher as if it were a weapon. "You seem distracted, my dear," Lord Blackwood observed, following her gaze. "Surely the servants aren't more interesting than your intended husband." Heat flooded her cheeks, but she forced herself to meet his cold gaze. "Of course not, my lord. I was merely ensuring our guests were properly served." "How thoughtful." His smile was sharp enough to cut. "Though I prefer my wife's attention to be focused entirely on me, I find divided loyalty problematic." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ilara's mouth went dry with fear, not for herself but for Marcus, if Lord Blackwood suspected anything between them. As if summoned by her thoughts, Marcus approached their end of the table to refill the wine-glasses. As he leaned over to pour Lord Blackwood's wine, the nobleman's hand shot out, gripping Marcus's wrist with bruising force. "You," Lord Blackwood said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power. "You're clumsy. You nearly spilled wine on my sleeve." It was a lie. Marcus had moved with perfect precision, but the accusation hung in the air like a blade. Around the table conversation died as everyone turned to watch the confrontation. "My apologies, my lord," Marcus said quietly, but Ilara could hear the steel beneath his calm tone. "Apologies aren't enough." Lord Blackwood's grip tightened, and Ilara saw Marcus's jaw clench with pain. "Perhaps you need a lesson in proper respect." Without warning, his other hand came up in a sharp, backhanded blow aimed at Marcus's face. It never connected. Marcus caught Lord Blackwood's wrist mid-swing with inhuman speed, his own grip like a steel trap. For a moment the two men were frozen in a tableau of violence, Lord Blackwood's pale eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. "I wouldn't," Marcus said softly, and his voice carried a weight of authority that seemed to fill the hall like a physical presence. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lady Margaret gasped, Roderick half rose from his seat, and the other guests stared in horrified fascination. But Ilara only had eyes for Marcus, for the way power seemed to radiate from him like heat, for the predatory grace that transformed him from servant to something altogether more dangerous. "You dare!" Lord Blackwood sputtered, his face flushing with rage and humiliation. "You dare lay hands on your betters!" Marcus's smile was sharp as a blade, cold as winter wind. "Betters?" He released Lord Blackwood's wrist with calculated gentleness, but the nobleman rubbed the spot as if it pained him. "Tell me, Lord Blackwood, what makes you think you're my better?" The question was soft, conversational, but it carried an undercurrent of menace that made several guests push back from the table. Ilara watched in fascination and growing terror as Marcus seemed to shed his servant's persona like a discarded cloak, revealing something underneath that was magnificent and terrible and utterly compelling. "You're a servant," Lord Blackwood said, but uncertainty flickered in his pale eyes. "Am I?" Marcus tilted his head, studying the nobleman like a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "What would you say if I told you that I've killed men for lesser insults than what you just offered Lady Ilara?" The words were spoken in the same conversational tone one might use to discuss the weather, but they sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with temperature. This was not the voice of a stable hand. This was the voice of someone accustomed to absolute authority, someone whose word could mean the difference between life and death. "You're threatening me?" Lord Blackwood's voice cracked slightly. "I'm educating you." Marcus stepped closer, and suddenly he seemed larger, more imposing, radiating a power that made the nobleman instinctively retreat. "Lady Ilara is under my protection. Anyone who threatens her, anyone who seeks to harm her, will answer to me." "Protection?" Lord Blackwood looked around the table desperately, seeking support that wasn't forthcoming. Even Roderick seemed frozen by the display of raw authority. "She doesn't belong to you. She's mine by right of contract." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, something that made the air itself seem to thicken with threat. "Contract? With whom?" "Her stepmother agreed." "Her stepmother," Marcus interrupted softly, "has no authority to make such agreements." The statement hung in the air like smoke. Lady Margaret stood abruptly, her face pale with growing panic. "What do you mean? Of course I have authority. Ilara is my stepdaughter, my responsibility." "Actually," Marcus said, turning that predatory attention on her, "she isn't." The words were like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of confusion through the assembled guests. Ilara felt her world tilt on its axis as she stared at Marcus, trying to understand what he meant. "Explain yourself," Lord Blackwood demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Marcus smiled, and it was the expression of a man who had just decided to stop pretending to be harmless. "Gladly. You see, Lady Ilara's father didn't simply go to the capital on business. He went to formalise an existing betrothal contract, one that was signed when she was a child." "Impossible," Lady Margaret breathed. "Is it?" Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document, the parchment bearing an official seal that gleamed in the candlelight. "Lord Ashworth's signature is quite clear, as is the identity of the man his daughter was promised to." He unfolded the document with deliberate care, and Ilara caught a glimpse of her father's familiar handwriting alongside another signature that made her blood freeze in her veins. "Marcus Wolfhart," he read aloud, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent hall. "Alpha King of the Northern Territories!" The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Gasps echoed from the assembled guests. Lady Margaret swayed as if she might faint, and Lord Blackwood's face went white as parchment. But Ilara only stared at the man she had fallen in love with, finally understanding the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. The servant she had shown kindness to, the stable hand she had defended, the man she had kissed in the lamplight of the stables. He had been a king all along, and according to the contract he held, she had belonged to him since childhood. "Hello, my lady," Marcus said softly, his storm-grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "I believe it's time we were properly introduced. I am Marcus Wolfhart, Alpha King of the Northern Territories." His smile was gentle now, tinged with the same vulnerability she had glimpsed in the stable. "And you, Lady Ilara Ashworth, are my promised bride." The words settled over the room like a blanket of snow, muffling all sound, all breath, all thought. In the candlelit magnificence of the great hall, surrounded by the wreckage of her step-family's ambitions and Lord Blackwood's thwarted plans, Ilara finally understood the full scope of the game that had been playing out around her. She had thought she was choosing between duty and love. She had never realised they were the same thing. The silence that followed Marcus's revelation stretched like a taut bowstring, ready to snap. Ilara stared at the contract in his hands, her father's signature stark black against the parchment, and felt the world she had known crumble around her like sandcastles before an incoming tide. The Alpha King, the man she had fallen in love with, the servant she had defended, the stranger she had kissed in lamplight. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and she was his promised bride. "This is impossible," Lady Margaret breathed, her face ashen. "A betrothal contract? There was never any mention—" "Of course there wasn't," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The transformation was complete now. Gone was any pretense of civility, replaced by a presence that seemed to fill the entire hall. Your husband needed to ensure his daughter's future before revealing his financial difficulties to his new wife. The words hit like a physical blow. Around the table the assembled guests sat frozen, torn between terror and fascination at witnessing such a dramatic reversal of power. Lord Blackwood's pale eyes darted between Marcus and the door, clearly calculating his chances of escape. "You're lying," Roderick said suddenly, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is some elaborate hoax. You can't be—" "Can't be what?" Marcus turned that predatory attention on him, and Roderick visibly shrank back. "Can't be powerful enough to destroy your family's reputation with a single word? Can't be wealthy enough to make your debts disappear, or ensure they ruin you? Can't be dangerous enough to make you disappear entirely if you continue to threaten what belongs to me?" Each question was delivered with deadly calm, but the underlying menace was unmistakable. This was not a man making empty threats. This was someone stating facts with the confidence of absolute power. "Belongs to you." Ilara found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than she intended. "I'm not property to be owned." Marcus's expression softened as he turned to her, and for a moment she glimpsed the gentle man who had tended horses and shared his secrets in the stable's golden light. "No, my lady, you're not property, you're my mate, my chosen queen, my equal in all things." He moved closer, seemingly oblivious to the room full of witnesses. "The contract your father signed was not about ownership, it was about protection. He knew war was coming to these lands, knew he might not survive to keep you safe, so he ensured you would be under the protection of someone with the power to defend you." "War?" she whispered. "Lord Blackwood's ambitions extend far beyond a simple marriage alliance," Marcus said, his gaze never leaving her face. "He's been gathering allies, building an army, preparing to challenge the established order in the Northern Territories. Your father discovered this plot and sought to protect you from becoming a pawn in Blackwood's game." All eyes turned to Lord Blackwood, whose face had gone from pale to a sickly grey. "You can't prove any of that." Marcus smiled, and it was the expression of a predator who had been toying with his prey. "Can't I?" He reached into his jacket again and withdrew another document, this one bearing multiple seals. "Correspondence between you and Lord Vance of the Eastern March. Detailed plans for dividing the Northern Territories between your allied houses. Lists of nobles you've already corrupted with gold or threatened into compliance." Each revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Lord Blackwood's carefully constructed facade crumbled as the evidence of his treachery was laid bare. "You know nothing," Blackwood snarled, abandoning all pretense of civility. "You're a mongrel king ruling savages in the wilderness. I have the backing of civilized nobles, the support of—" "Of no one," Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through Blackwood's bluster like a blade through silk. "Your allies abandoned you the moment they learned I was here. Your army has been disbanded. Your plans lie in ruins." "Impossible. You've been playing servant in these stables for days. You couldn't have—" "Couldn't have what? Couldn't have been in communication with my forces? Couldn't have been gathering intelligence about your movements?" Marcus's smile turned sharp. "Lord Blackwood, did you truly believe the Alpha King would travel alone into potentially hostile territory without backup?" As if summoned by his words, the great hall's doors burst open. Armed men poured through the entrances, moving with the disciplined precision of elite soldiers. They wore the dark leather and silver emblems of the Northern Territories, and the aura of barely leashed violence that surrounded them made several guests cry out in terror. But it was the man who entered last who commanded attention. Tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and scars that spoke of countless battles, he moved with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a seasoned commander. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing slightly to Marcus, "the perimeter is secured. Lord Blackwood's men have been discouraged from interfering." "Thank you, Captain Thorne." Marcus's acknowledgement of the title sent another ripple of shock through the room. No servant commanded a captain. No stable hand inspired such obvious respect and loyalty. Lord Blackwood lurched to his feet, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "This is an act of war, an invasion of sovereign territory." "Actually," Marcus said conversationally, "this is a social call. I came to collect my bride and attend to some business matters." His eyes glinted with cold amusement. "The fact that you chose to threaten her in my presence simply moved up my timeline." "You can't take her," Lady Margaret said desperately. The law," Marcus cut her off, "recognises the validity of the betrothal contract signed by her father. The law also recognises my authority as Alpha King to protect my subjects from treasonous plots." His gaze swept the room, taking in every terrified face. "Unless someone wishes to challenge that authority." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Roderick, for all his earlier bluster, seemed to have finally grasped the magnitude of the situation. But Ilara barely heard any of it. Her mind was reeling, trying to process the rapid succession of revelations. War, conspiracy, a betrothal contract signed when she was a child. The man she loved was not just nobility. He was royalty of the highest order. "You lied to me," she said quietly, the words cutting through the tension like a knife. Marcus went very still. When he turned to face her fully, she saw vulnerability in his storm-grey eyes that seemed at odds with the power he had just displayed. "Yes," he said simply, "I did." "About everything?" "About my identity, about my station, about the reasons I was here." He stepped closer, ignoring the room full of witnesses, his attention focused entirely on her. "But never about my feelings for you. Never about the way you made me feel when you defended me, when you tended my supposed wounds, when you looked at me as if I mattered. But it was all a test," she said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "You came here to test me, to see if I was worthy of being your queen." "Yes." The admission came out rough, as if it cost him to voice it. "I had to know, not just that you were kind, but that your kindness was genuine. Not just that you were brave, but that your courage came from your heart rather than calculation." He reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself. "I had to know that you could love me for who I am, not what I could give you." "And now you know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now I know." His voice held wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe it. "You defended a stranger you believed to be beneath your station. You risked your stepmother's anger for the sake of kindness. You chose to trust me despite your fears, chose to care for me despite the social consequences." "I chose to love you," she whispered. The words hung between them like a bridge, an invitation to cross back into the intimacy they had shared before the weight of crowns and kingdoms had settled between them. "And I chose to love you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion, "not because of any contract, not because of political necessity, but because you saw me, truly saw me, and chose to be kind anyway." Something shifted in the air between them, the tension of revelation and fear transforming into something else entirely. Around them, the room full of witnesses seemed to fade into insignificance as the truth of their connection blazed bright and undeniable. "Ilara," Marcus said, and her name on his lips was a prayer, a plea, a promise all at once. I know I deceived you about who I was. I know you have every right to refuse me, contract or no contract. But I'm asking you now, not as your king, not as your promised husband, but as the man who fell in love with your courage. Will you have me?" The question hung in the candle-lit air, weighted with possibility. She could refuse him. Despite the contract, despite his power, she knew he would honour her choice. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he stood perfectly still, waiting for her verdict. But as she looked at him, really looked at him, she saw past the crown and the power to the man underneath. The man who had gentled horses with patient hands, the man who had listened to her dreams as if they mattered. The man who had kissed her in lamplight and made her feel precious. "You're still you," she said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "King or stable hand, you're still the man who showed kindness to animals, who treated me as an equal, who made me feel safe." "Always," he said fiercely, "whatever crown I wear, whatever duties I carry, I will always be the man who loves you more than his own life." The declaration sent warmth spiralling through her chest, settling like golden honey in her bones. This was Marcus, her Marcus, beneath all the revelations and political complications. "Then yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I'll have you, not because of any contract, not because of political necessity, but because I choose you, I choose us." The smile that transformed his face was radiant as sunrise, and before she could take another breath, he had crossed the space between them and swept her into his arms. His kiss was fierce and desperate and full of promises she couldn't wait to hear him keep. Around them, the great hall erupted into chaos as the full implications of what had just occurred sank in. Lord Blackwood was shouting about rights and treaties, Lady Margaret was demanding explanations, and the guests were murmuring among themselves in voices that ranged from awed to terrified. But Ilara heard none of it. She was lost in the taste of Marcus's kiss, in the strength of his arms around her, in the absolute certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers and spoke in a voice meant only for her ears. "My queen," he murmured, "my mate, my heart." "My king," she replied, tasting the words and finding them sweet. "My protector, my love." And in the candle-lit magnificence of the great hall, surrounded by the wreckage of political schemes and social conventions, Ilara finally understood the truth her heart had known from the beginning. She had shown kindness to a servant and found herself chosen by a king. But more than that, she had opened her heart to love and discovered that sometimes, just sometimes, love was enough to transform everything. 3 months later, Ilara stood on the balcony of the Northern Palace, watching the sun rise over mountains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The view still took her breath away. Peaks crowned with snow even in summer, forests so deep and green they seemed to pulse with life, and skies so vast they made her feel both insignificant and infinite at the same time. It was nothing like the carefully manicured gardens of her stepmother's estate, and she loved every wild, untamed inch of it. "The sunrise suits you," Marcus said softly, appearing behind her with the silent grace that still surprised her. His arms came around her waist, pulling her back against the warmth of his chest, and she melted into his embrace as naturally as breathing. "I was just thinking how different everything is now," she murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. 3 months ago, I thought I knew exactly what my future would hold. Miserable marriage to a cruel lord, a lifetime of biting your tongue and making yourself small." His voice held a hint of the anger that still flared whenever he thought about what her stepfamily had tried to force upon her. "Among other things." She turned in his arms, studying the face that had become more precious to her than her own. The sharp cheekbones and storm-grey eyes were the same, but there was a peace in his expression, now that hadn't been there during those tense days of deception. I thought I knew what love was supposed to feel like. I thought it would be smaller than this." His smile was soft, tinged with wonder that still appeared whenever she spoke of her feelings. "And now? Now I know that love isn't small at all. It's enormous. It's terrifying. It's—" She searched for words adequate to describe the golden warmth that seemed to live in her chest now, the way her heart raced whenever he looked at her as if she were something miraculous. "It's everything. Everything," he agreed, and leaned down to kiss her with the gentle thoroughness that never failed to make her knees weak. When they broke apart, both breathing a little unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Ilara Wolfheart." The name still sent a thrill through her. Ilara Wolfheart, Queen of the Northern Territories, mate to the Alpha King, wife to the man who had disguised himself as a servant and won her heart through kindness rather than power. "I love you too," she whispered back, "even if you are the most dramatic man alive. Honestly, Marcus, you could have just introduced yourself properly from the beginning." He laughed, the sound rich and warm in the morning air. "And missed the chance to see you threaten your stepbrother with stable implements in my defence? Never." The memory made her cheek. During those first days at the palace, as the reality of her new position sank in, she had worried that Marcus might grow tired of her. After all, he was a king with the responsibilities of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. What could a former nobleman's stepdaughter possibly offer him? The answer, as it turned out, was everything he had never known he needed. "Your Majesty," a gentle voice interrupted their private moment. Captain Thorne stood in the doorway to the balcony, his expression apologetic but urgent. "Forgive the intrusion, but the morning briefing is ready." Marcus sighed, his arms tightening around Ilara for just a moment before he released her. "Of course. Thank you, Captain." "Actually," Ilara said, an idea forming, "may I attend today?" Both men looked at her in surprise. Over the past months, she had occasionally sat in on council meetings, but the morning briefings were typically reserved for military and security matters. "Are you certain?" Marcus asked. "Today's agenda includes rather tedious discussions about border patrol schedules and supply logistics." "I'm certain." She straightened her shoulders, calling up the regal bearing that still felt new but increasingly natural. "A queen should understand all aspects of her kingdom's protection, don't you think?" The pride that blazed in Marcus's eyes made her heart flutter. "Lead the way, Captain." The morning briefing was indeed filled with tactical discussions and supply chain concerns, but Ilara found herself fascinated by the complexity of ruling a territory as vast as the northern kingdoms. Marcus handled each issue with the same patient attention, whether it was a minor boundary dispute between villages or a major trade negotiation with the southern courts. Watching him work, seeing the respect and loyalty he commanded from his advisers, she understood why he had needed to test her character so thoroughly. A king needed a queen who would stand beside him, not behind him, someone who could be trusted with the weight of a crown and the responsibility for thousands of lives. "What do you think, my lady?" Marcus asked suddenly, drawing her attention back to the discussion. "Lord Garrett suggests increasing patrols along the eastern border. You know that region from your travels with the relief efforts." The question was delivered casually, but Ilara caught the deeper meaning. He was asking for her counsel in front of his advisers, making it clear that he valued her opinion and expected others to do the same. "The eastern villages have been nervous since Lord Blackwood's arrest," she said, considering the issue carefully. "Increased patrols would certainly provide reassurance, but I wonder if we might also consider establishing a permanent outpost there, something that shows our commitment to their protection rather than just our ability to respond to threats." "An interesting suggestion," Lord Garrett mused. "It would require significant resources to build and maintain, but it would also provide local employment and demonstrate that we view the Eastern Territories as integral parts of the kingdom rather than distant concerns," Marcus added, his eyes bright with approval. "Draft a proposal, Lord Garrett. Include cost estimates for both options." The meeting continued for another hour, covering everything from harvest reports to diplomatic correspondence. When it finally ended, Ilara found herself energized rather than exhausted. This was what she had been born for, she realized. Not to sit quietly and look decorative, but to help shoulder the burden of leadership. "You were magnificent," Marcus said as they walked back to their private chambers. "That suggestion about the Eastern outpost was brilliant." "You don't think I overstepped?" "I think you acted like a queen," he replied firmly. "My queen, my equal partner in all things." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Ilara, do you know what convinced me that first day in the kitchen? It wasn't just your kindness to me. It was the way you stood up to your stepmother, the way you took responsibility for your decision, despite knowing it would cost you. You have the heart of a ruler, love. I just needed to help you find it." The words sent warmth spiraling through her chest. In her old life, her opinions had been dismissed, her thoughts considered irrelevant. Here, Marcus actively sought her counsel and made it clear to everyone that she was his partner in every sense. "I have something for you," he said suddenly, reaching into his jacket. "I was going to wait until tonight, but—" He withdrew a small wooden box, simple and unadorned, so different from the elaborate gifts he had been showering her with that it immediately captured her attention. Inside, nestled on white silk, was a pendant unlike anything she had ever seen. It was shaped like a tree, its trunk and branches crafted from silver so fine it seemed to glow with inner light. But it was the leaves that made her gasp. Hundreds of tiny emeralds, each one catching the light like captured starshine. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "But Marcus, you don't need to—" "It's not about need," he interrupted gently, lifting the pendant from the box. "Do you know what this is?" She shook her head, transfixed by the way the emeralds seemed to pulse with their own light. "It's a heartwood pendant. My people believe that when two souls are truly mated, their connection grows like a tree. Deep roots, strong trunk, branches that reach toward the light." His fingers were gentle as he fastened the chain around her neck, his touch sending familiar electricity racing across her skin. "The emeralds are from the mine where my parents first met. They represent the growth of love over time, the way it deepens and spreads until it becomes an integral part of who you are." The pendant settled against her chest, right over her heart, and she could swear she felt warmth radiating from it. "It's perfect." "There's more," he said, his voice dropping to that rough tone that always made her pulse quicken. "According to legend, a heartwood pendant will only glow when worn by someone who has found their true mate." He stepped back slightly, and his eyes widened in wonder. "Look." Ilara looked down and gasped. The pendant was indeed glowing, the emeralds pulsing with soft green light that seemed to match the rhythm of her heartbeat. "Magic," she whispered. "Love," Marcus corrected, his voice thick with emotion. "Just love." She launched herself into his arms, and he caught her easily, spinning her around as their laughter echoed through the hallway. When he finally set her down, she could see the same amazement in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. "I have something for you too," she said, sudden inspiration striking. "Not a gift exactly, but—" She led him to their private sitting room, where she had been working on a project for weeks. On the writing desk sat a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her careful handwriting. "I've been documenting our story," she explained, feeling suddenly shy. "From that first day when you appeared at the kitchen door, through all the moments that led us here. I thought perhaps some day our children might want to know how their parents fell in love." Marcus picked up the journal with hands that trembled slightly, opening it to a random page and reading silently. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. She didn't know that showing kindness to a weary traveller would change the course of her entire life, he read aloud. She only knew that he looked like he needed help, and helping people in need was as natural to her as breathing. He closed the journal carefully, as if it contained something precious beyond measure. "You make me sound far more noble than I deserve." "I write you as I see you," she said simply. "The man who was willing to give up his crown rather than force me into marriage. The king who disguises himself as a servant to learn the true character of his people. The husband who listens to my ideas and makes me feel like I can change the world." "You can change the world," he said fiercely, pulling her into his arms again. "You already have. You changed mine." As afternoon faded into evening, they talked about their plans for the kingdom, their hopes for the future, their dreams of the family they would build together. When the sun finally set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus led her to the great hall where their people waited. The evening meal had become a celebration, as it so often did in the Northern Palace. Unlike the formal, tension-filled dinners of her childhood, these gatherings were filled with laughter and music, stories and shared joy. Ilara took her place beside Marcus at the high table, wearing her heartwood pendant with pride, and looked out over the faces of the people who had become her family. "My friends," Marcus said, rising to address the hall, 3 months ago I returned from a journey with the most precious treasure I had ever found." His hand found hers, warm and steady. Not gold or jewels, but something far more valuable. A woman whose kindness could gentle the fiercest beast, whose courage could inspire armies, whose love could heal even the deepest wounds. The hall erupted in cheers and applause, and Ilara felt her cheeks warm with pleasure. These people had welcomed her not because she was their queen by right, but because Marcus loved her, and she had proven herself worthy of that love through her actions. "Tonight," Marcus continued, "we celebrate not just our queen, but the truth she taught me, that real strength comes from gentleness, real power comes from service, and real love comes from choosing to see the best in each other, even when the world tells us to expect the worst." More cheers filled the air, and someone started a song that others quickly took up. It was a ballad about a king who disguised himself as a beggar to find a wife who would love him for his heart rather than his crown, and Ilara laughed with delight when she realized they had turned their love story into legend. Later, as they danced together in the firelight, Marcus spun her close and whispered in her ear, "Any regrets, my queen?" She looked around at the hall filled with joy, at the people who had become her family, at the man who had seen past her circumstances to the person she could become, and shook her head. "None," she said firmly. "How could I regret the path that led me to you? Even though I lied about who I was?" "You showed me who you were every day," she corrected. "In your patience with the horses, your kindness to the other servants, your willingness to protect me despite the risk to yourself. The crown was just details." Marcus threw back his head and laughed, pure joy radiating from him like light from the sun. "I love you, Ilara Wolfheart, my queen, my mate, my heart." "And I love you," she replied, spinning under his arm as the music swelled around them. "My king, my husband, my home." As the evening wound down and they finally retired to their chambers, Ilara caught sight of herself in the mirror, hair tumbling loose from its careful arrangement, cheeks flushed with laughter and dancing, the heartwood pendant glowing softly at her throat. She looked nothing like the perfectly proper lady her stepmother had tried to mould her into. She looked happy, she looked free, she looked loved. Behind her reflection she could see Marcus watching her with the same expression of wonder he had worn that first night when she had defended him to her step-family, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune, as if she was something miraculous that might disappear if he looked away. "No more disguises," she said softly, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "Promise me, from now on we face everything together as ourselves." "No more disguises," he agreed, moving to stand behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. "Though I have to admit I'm rather fond of the servants' clothes I wore. They're folded in our wardrobe, you know." "As a reminder." "As a reminder," he confirmed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "of the day a kind lady changed my life forever." Outside their windows, the Northern Territories stretched vast and wild under a canopy of stars. Somewhere out there, other stories were beginning. Other hearts were finding their way to love. Other lonely souls were discovering that kindness could indeed change the world. But here, in the warmth of their chambers, in the circle of each other's arms, Ilara and Marcus had already found everything they would ever need. She had shown kindness to a servant and discovered he was a king. But more importantly, she had opened her heart to love and learned that sometimes love was the most powerful magic of all. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts on these stories of unexpected love and second chances. If you'd like to support me, please subscribe. It's free and it helps more people hear these tales of hearts finding their way home.